On a gloomy autumn afternoon in 1968, the Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards sat in the apartment of art dealer Robert Fraser, chain-smoking, snorting coke and heroin, and just generally feeling sorry for himself. The band had suffered a critical and commercial failure back in 1967 with their panned album Their Satanic Majesty's Request, especially in contrast to their media rival the Beatles, who had released Sgt. Pepper's the very same year. The band was also suffering internally, with founding member Brian Jones's mental and physical state rapidly declining. But most personally for Keith, his partner Anita Pallenberg was starring in a film, Performance, as the love interest for, of all people, Mick Jagger. Sitting in this room, decorated with Tibetan skulls, Moroccan tapestries and tantric art, Keith was lounging around with his guitar and then started to write. Just as he was doing this, London decided to do what it does best, and began to rain. But it began to really rain, and as the storm worsened, Keith watched, in his words, pedestrians scurrying in all directions for shelter, their faces whipped by torrential rain. He called it an incredible monsoon, watching people out of that Mount Street window looking for shelter. The birth of the Rolling Stones' greatest song taking place there. The song he wrote was personal, about the dejection he felt with his life, the band, and his romance. But Gimme Shelter, the song that came from this afternoon, captured a zeitgeist much bigger than Richard's personal life, and became something of a soundtrack to the end of the 60s, the end of an era of hope, and created what would become the Rolling Stones' Anthem of the Apocalypse. Keith Richards himself has been less grandiose about it though, saying that you get lucky sometimes. It was a shitty day. I had nothing better to do. Whatever comes to mind when you think of the 1960s, nobody argues the decade was uneventful. It was the decade that saw the cultural touchstone of the Summer of Love and the Sexual Revolution. It saw political events like the assassination of Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the climax of the Civil Rights Movement and the human achievement of man reaching new heights in space. However, the end of the 1960s was a much more worrisome time. The illusions of the hippie movement had been shattered by the Manson murders, Martin Luther King Jr. was dead, and American involvement in Vietnam was ramping up. Even the Beatles, the group more than any representing the 60s, had turned in on themselves and were collapsing by the end of the decade. In his book Counting Down the Rolling Stones, Jim Baviglia says that Gimme Shelter eerily captures that moment when people realised how messed up things truly were. If you're enjoying this video, please do consider leaving a like, comment and subscribing. Only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are subscribed, so chances are that this is your first time seeing one of my videos. It really helps the channel out, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. The song begins with Keith Richards' arpeggiated guitar, harmonising mostly in thirds and fourths. Keith Richards here plays in open E tuning, a guitar tuning that sees the strings tuned E, B, E, G sharp, B, E, as opposed to the standard E, A, D, G, B, E. Keith Richards is often associated with these open tunings, specifically open G, which is also my favourite guitar tuning, and Gimme Shelter is a great example of this. It's been pointed out by a number of critics and authors that blues musician Jimmy Reed's guitar playing was an influence on Richards' style here, as was Chuck Berry's. He played the track on an Australian Mason EG240 Supreme, a Gibson-esque guitar, borrowed from a man who was crashing out with Richards at the time, although in typical Keith Richards fashion, he's got no idea the man's name or who he was. Another guitar enters in the intro, playing little fills and melodies. Johnny Marr called the song perfect, and it's not hard to see the influence that Keith Richards has had on Johnny Marr's playing here, with a very similar kind of style here in Gimme Shelter as in a lot of the Smiths' work. A tonic pedal note of C sharp ties the otherwise loose-feeling opening section together, with the drums playing a syncopated pattern. Until the main groove of the song comes in a great moment of coming together, where we get the piano, the bass line, and most of all the drums switching from a syncopated pattern to hitting on beat. Baviglia called it like emerging from a misty rainforest into the heart of a city in strife. The live nature of the recording is apparent in a few little magical moments where very small things can be heard. For example, in the intro, there's a very high piano part that's incredibly hard to hear. I saw it on some transcriptions when doing the research for this video, and thought it was a bizarre mistake, but eventually I began to hear it myself, and now I find it quite charming. There's a moment of Mick Jagger whooping in the background later on, which we'll get to as well. In the verse, the bass line is still based around this C-sharp pedal, but actually moves about chromatically quite a bit. Although it's very quiet in the mix. Richard's guitar strums chords instead of the plucked sound of the intro, creating a more punchy, aggressive sound, especially since he's only strumming the heavier bottom strings of the guitar. He plays a progression alternating between C-sharp minor and C-sharp major, with an F-sharp major chord that is only really heard in passing in the middle. This verse is where we get our first taste of Jagger's lyrics in the song. singing about a storm threatening his life, a foreboding and ominous image which sets the tone for a foreboding and ominous song. Mick Jagger said that it was an end-of-the-world kind of song, really. It's apocalypse, the whole record's like that. The chorus is the first moment of duet between Mick Jagger and the guest vocalist, Louisiana gospel singer Mary Clayton. A descending bass line and chord progression retain the eerie feeling, and slight differences in rhythm between the two vocal parts give a loose feeling to the section. We also get a mostly two-note harmonica solo from Mick Jagger, something which he himself has been a little disparaging of, and a typical Richards guitar solo featuring lots of bluesy bending. But few would argue against the bridge as being the standout section of the song, seeing Jagger step back entirely and leave the lead vocals to Clayton, who lets out, along with Pink Floyd's The Great Gig in the Sky, classic rock's greatest session vocal. It was the record producer Jack Nietzsche who suggested Clayton to the band, ringing up her husband Curtis Amy at midnight and hoping for a positive response. Luckily for music history, that positive response was what the band got. Still in her pink pyjamas and 4 months pregnant, Clayton wrapped a Chanel scarf around her still-in hair rollers, did her makeup and headed to the studio, saying in a later interview that there's no way she was going to go to the studio other than beautiful. When she arrived at Hollywood's Sunset Sound Studios, she was already unimpressed about having been bothered at midnight by the band, not really knowing who the Rolling Stones were, but this was only exacerbated when she read the lyrics. She said to Jagger and Richards, "Rape, murder, you sure that's what you want me to sing, honey?" She did take the first chorus, and everyone in the studio showed their gratitude, but she wanted to talk about royalties before going any further, ringing up her husband and talking purposely loudly on the phone, as to be heard by the band saying, "These boys want me to sing about rape and murder." 3 takes later, and rock history was made. After listening back, the band called it bloody fabulous, and Mick Jagger can be heard enthusiastically whooping after Clayton's iconic voice crack. The lyrics she sings are highly evocative, and are deeply rooted in violence. Rape, murder, it's just a shot away. She reaches the vocal heights of an E5 here. But the intricacies of her performance are far more interesting than the actual notes she hits. A perfect slight rasp hits on the beginning of some of the notes, and wild voice cracks lend the line an unbelievable energy. More audible in the isolated vocal track than in the final mix, she also pulls off an impressive gospel-inspired run at the end of the bridge. She did her 3 takes and then went home. Unfortunately, the song's recording has a rather depressing but unignorable ending, with Clayton suffering a miscarriage the very next day, something she attributes to the physical strain of pushing open the studio doors and reaching to hit the vocal highs of the song. It took her a long time to listen to the song afterwards, associating it with this tragic event, but eventually she was able to overcome it and feel comfortable singing the song. Gimme Shelter was never released as a single, but was released in November 1969 alongside their acclaimed album Let It Bleed, which would chart at number 1 in the UK and number 3 in the US. The record was released before their disastrous Altamont Free concert in December 1969, an event that would see 4 deaths, including the stabbing and beating to death of an 18-year-old Meredith Hunter, and countless injuries and significant property damage. The Hells Angels ran security at the gig, and it turned into a hell like that described in the song. The subsequent documentary that covered the event the year later was called Gimme Shelter, something that the film writer Dan Inav called a winter of discontent after the summer of love. Beyond a couple of other facts about the song, like the fact it's the favourite Stones song of Barack Obama, that's the story of Gimme Shelter, the Rolling Stones' Apocalyptic Anthem. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment. It really helps the channel out. And once again, thanks for watching.